Welcome in to the 411 on Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, Blake Lovell, back here on Tuesday with some thoughts on the 2021 edition of the WWE Draft, which is officially in the books after night one last week on SmackDown, night two on Raw this week. And let's jump into some thoughts on some of these moves. Really, we always say there are going to be winners and losers when it comes to the draft, but a lot of that is yet to be determined based on how these people are booked, if they've switched brands or if they have new, talent to work with on the brand they were already on. So a lot of this is purely guesswork, but we will base it on what we've seen from WWE to this point and perhaps what we could see with some of the people that have been sort of moved around. So all I have here is I have pulled up both of the rosters now that are going to be official on October the 22nd, which I think in and of itself is kind of strange to have the draft and then say, well, we're not going to start this for several weeks later, but this is just how it works. We understand that. And so this will take place after Crown Jewel on, following that pay-per-view, which will be on October the 21st. So now let's go into looking at some of these moves. I think when you look at it, we'll start with Raw. I think one of the biggest winners here right off the bat when you look at the new Raw roster, to me, is Angelo Dawkins. Now, I know that may be one, to start with, you're thinking, well, they're not really placed as a top act, but when you think about it, the Street Profits are a team that, has really been used quite a bit. I mean, they haven't really fallen into any sort of spot beyond, being a pretty featured tag team since they've been on the main roster. And we talked about it recently, the potential, were they going to split up the Street Profits, which we'll get into the whole splitting up teams in just a few minutes, because that was once again a theme in this draft as well. But I think Angelo Dawkins is a winner here because they didn't split up the Street Profits right off the bat when they could have done that. And I think it would have felt like one of those compared to some of the others that they are splitting up, whether that's Tegan Nox and Shotzi, whether it's Veer and Shanky or some of the others, that you look around these rosters and say, well, why did they split these up? Was there any reason for it? Nope. They just wanted to split it up to give you that draft, anything can happen type of feel. They had kind of played up the possibility that this could happen with the Street Profits with Dawkins and Montez Ford. And we've discussed potentially them going the route of making Montez Ford a featured solo act, which they can still do even with both of them on Raw. But I think Dawkins is a winner here because I don't really think they had set anything up to make you think that had they split these two, and let's say you put Ford on Raw, you put Dawkins on SmackDown, which I'm sure was considered at some point. They didn't really give you anything to believe that they were going to do anything with Dawkins beyond, potentially him being another one of those that we look at and say, well, the draft really hurt him more than it hurt his tag team partner. So again, that's nothing against Dawkins. I think he's, they're great in their act, but I think it's all about the setup, and I don't think they had really set up anything that well to where had they broken these two up, Montez Ford just came off of a 20-minute main event on SmackDown with Roman Reigns. Meanwhile, Dawkins would have kind of probably been placed in a position, I think, this early. Now, they could have built to something eventually, but it just would have felt like they're doing this just for the sake of splitting them up, and I don't know what that would have meant for Angelo Dawkins. So I think that's one of the ones that stands out for me. I think Austin Theory, another one that's probably a pretty big winner when you consider, I know going from NXT, there's always a risk, but he had a pretty fun role with the way and everything they were doing in NXT, but they immediately put him out there with Jeff Hardy, and he gets the better of Jeff Hardy. Now, I think how that plays out, we'll see, but clearly they see something in Austin Theory now versus, when he was on the main roster, a year ago, or however long it's been at this point. So I think he can probably be considered one of the winners on this. The whole Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, Bianca Belair, I think in that scenario, I don't really know what you categorize them as, because I don't, they're basically just switching brands, some of them, and maybe we have the switching of the titles. Maybe Sasha wins the triple threat at Crown Jewel, since Becky and Bianca are both in that match, and now they're on Raw, Sasha's on SmackDown. Maybe that's how you get the SmackDown Championship women's title back to SmackDown. But then you've got the situation with the Raw Women's title with Charlotte. I'm not sure what direction they go. Maybe they just swap the belts like we've seen before. I don't think they're going to go that way, but I guess that's always a possibility with WWE. You could see that happen, but I don't know if there's a lot to take away from the women's side other than you're putting this in a scenario where Becky and Bianca are on the same brand, but they're just on Raw this time instead of on SmackDown, which of course also plays into one of the biggest winners, I think, of this draft, and that's the couples, because Seth Rollins also moves to Raw with Becky Lynch. We talked about Montez Ford. He moves to Raw, or, he's on Raw now with Bianca Belair as well. So they keep the couples together, I think, for the most part. I don't, I'm not up to date necessarily on all my WWE talent relationships, but I think for the most part, they did that for a lot of people here, if not everyone. There may be a few I'm forgetting, but I think that was another winner from this. I think when you look down the rest of them, I don't know that there's a ton that stands out necessarily. Edge goes back to Raw. I mean, I guess that gives you, the possibility of doing perhaps Edge and AJ Styles at some point. I don't, I don't know how long they're going to be able to get this Edge and Seth Rollins thing continuing, but it's at least continuing for the short term. So that gives you some new matches, I suppose, for Edge, for the possibility now, with him on Raw. Gable Steveson, I think, has to be one of the biggest winners. And the reason I say this is because this is someone who is not, he's not been in NXT. He's not been in any of that. Like, he is someone who is going straight from essentially being signed to being drafted to Raw. Like, he's not, NXT, none of that. And he had mentioned in an interview recently, and we put, some of the quotes on the site on 41mania.com about how he thought he was going to go straight to the main roster. They have set up this whole kind of training system and everything for him, even though he's still there, collegiately at Minnesota doing the stuff there. Like, they have set it up to where they're going to have him ready. And so I think, for him personally, he has to be considered one of the biggest winners of this draft. Even if fans don't necessarily know what to expect from him, and he is someone that is not going to be training long once they eventually do put him, in this sort of spot, which I don't think is going to be anytime soon. I don't think he's just going to be out there wrestling on Raw on October 22nd or anything. That's not going to happen. But they do get the press, the media, which we know the WWE loves that stuff, to be able to have an Olympic gold medalist like this, and to push that as someone who's going to be on Raw. That does give them, something they can use there until he is ready, which we don't know when that's going to be. But I think he has to be, again, considered one of the biggest winners, just based on making that jump there. Some of the others, Kevin Owens, I think, is someone else that remains to be seen. I feel like Kevin Owens is always kind of in that spot to where you're like, okay, they're getting ready to really kind of push him further and further and further, which, we've seen him be in some of these top feuds before. I don't want to make it as though WWE has never pushed this guy. Of course they have. But I feel like he's kind of been in a holding pattern for quite a while now. And maybe this switch to Raw is going to help him in terms of, put him in a spot where now there are some fresh matchups. Maybe he's someone that could work with Edge. I mean, he can work with some of these other guys, Bobby Lashley and people like that on Raw. So I think that's another one that's remains to be seen, probably yet to be determined of how necessarily we look at that from a grading standpoint. Is it a big win for Kevin Owens? We'll see. I think the same for someone like Liv Morgan, who, we've seen them now recently start to get pretty interested in pushing Liv Morgan. Is that the same now that she goes to Raw and she is, still there in that spot behind a Becky Lynch, behind a Bianca Belair and such? How does that unfold for her? So that's another intriguing one. Elsewhere, when you look down the roster, again, I'm just going through this here and looking. I mean, I assume that for, Rey and Dominic Mysterio, it's a change of scenery, them going to Raw as well. I don't know necessarily kind of where they're slotted. We know they've kind of had the interesting back and forth with them, and kind of the Rey playing the overbearing father and all this stuff, seemingly in some of the stuff they've been doing recently. But there's another, possibility. We'll see kind of what comes of that. But, gives them a fresh change of pace, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world for them at this point. Elsewhere, I mean, the rest of the Raw roster, I mean, we pointed out the sort of the splitting of some of the ones, like Tegan Nox, the split from Shotzi, which is one of those where it's like, oh, hey, look, the draft, anyone can get split up, teams can get split up. I think that's another one where it's just like, all right, we're just doing it to do it. We're doing it to play up that theme that anything can happen in the WWE draft, where teammates can get split up. When these two seemingly were due a WWE Women's Tag Team title shot for a couple of months now. It feels like maybe it hasn't been that long, but yeah, they never got their opportunity despite being the champions, and now they're split up, so they're no longer a team. So we'll see if that benefits both of them, or is this one of those where when you look around at the women's tag team division, what does that look like now? Right? Because they split up Natalya and Tamina too. That's another one that we look at. Tamina's now on Raw, Natalya's on SmackDown. So I feel like that it's sort of stop and start, which is nothing new with the women's tag team titles. And now you've broken up, several of your teams that they didn't have a whole lot of teams to begin with. So that's another I would probably point out as sort of a curious move. But is it surprising? No, it's not. We talked about the Veer and Shanky one. Veer also on, he's also there on Raw now, and Shanky's on SmackDown. So if we go over to the SmackDown roster, that's where you see some of these other. I think you look at it, and right off the bat, I think we could start with the call ups from NXT. You've got Aaliyah, you've got Hit Row, you've got Ridge Holland. I think this is what we always judge it on, right? Like, this is where we see for the people who get called up from NXT, what does this look like for them? And I think Hit Row, to me, is the biggest one. To where do they go from here when it comes to trying to figure out how is that act going to look? Because we've seen it. Like, this is to me personally, like, this is a great group. I enjoy this group and have enjoyed them in NXT. But what does it look like on the main roster? Because there is going to be, a lot more to it. And, yes, there's still going to need to be some work from an in-ring standpoint, for some of the people involved. I know people were talking about, the match between B-Fab and Elektra Lopez on NXT 2.0 recently. Wasn't the greatest match. You could see the potential there, but it was clear that, still needed to be some work. And that just comes with more experience. So maybe this is, hey, we're going to bring them up, and someone like B-Fab is going to get an opportunity to get that experience on the main roster, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but it will probably take time, perhaps, to be able to kind of get to that point. And I think this is where, how does WWE handle some of these acts that were put together in NXT, that were kind of managed, up until the new revamp? How do they continue to kind of that momentum? Does it continue? Or is it, okay, we have a group here, we have a faction. How long is it until we break them up? Like, I think sometimes that's what, we wait on and say, all right, how long is it going to take them to break this group up? Which we just talked about, sort of the theme with the tag teams and such. So I think that's an interesting thing we look at moving forward. That's certainly a storyline, is what does Hit Row do from here? Ridge Holland, the duo with Pete Dunne. What does it look like for Ridge Holland? Ridge Holland kind of feels like a Vince guy. So maybe, it's going to work out well for him, and perhaps there's some possibilities there for what he could do. So that I think is something right off the bat you look at and wonder, okay, what does it look like here for these people like that? Xia Li is another one that gets called up. What does it look like for her? Because, by the way, there's someone like Toni Storm who was called up, a couple months ago now. She hasn't done a whole lot. And so this is kind of what we look at and say, when they make these call-ups from NXT, what is your expectation? Like, there are higher expectations for some of these people who were featured in more top spots in NXT, like a Hit Row, I think. But you also know there's the possibility that, hey, you could have some of these people that just wind up sitting in the back, not doing a whole lot. And that's always the risk you're going to run when you maybe have that disconnect, which perhaps is not as much of a disconnect as it used to be with the main roster in NXT. We know that's not the case anymore, but that is something that you're always going to have in the back of your mind when you look at it that way. So that is something to look at there with the NXT call-ups. Then we go beyond that, an Angel Garza, Humberto Carrillo now on SmackDown, so they make the move over, as do Mansoor and Mustafa Ali. So we've seen that sort of mini feud on Raw recently. There's a couple tag teams, at least they're trying to keep in the mix. I, for one, am a sort of a big fan of the Garza Carrillo thing. I think there's potential there, but it's, what do you do with them? How do you use them moving forward? So that's another thing that you look at here. We talked about Charlotte moving from Raw to SmackDown. I think that's another one. It remains to be seen. I mean, is she going to keep the Raw Women's title on SmackDown? No. How do they get out of that? What do they do about it? Does she just instantly become the SmackDown champion? I don't think so. That wouldn't be my prediction right now. I think Sasha probably, I assume, wins it at Crown Jewel. But we'll see. We'll see how it happens. But clearly, you have Sasha and Charlotte back on the same brand again. So, you kind of know that they're going to go to that at some point, probably sooner rather than later, perhaps. With that, I think Drew McIntyre is one of the biggest winners here because, for Drew, he had kind of been in that spot where after he lost the title to Bobby Lashley and ultimately, was not able to regain it from Lashley when I think there were times where we kind of maybe thought he was going to. Drew just has not, been. I think he still feels like a star. Like he still feels like a top star in WWE. I don't want to make that statement because that he does. Like he's still a top star, but like he's lost some momentum from losing the championship, and we know like the challenges that came along for him with being the champion during the pandemic era and all of this. And now I think this gives him that fresh start. There was really nothing else for him to do on Raw. Now, he has weekly, not just, that Survivor Series match he had with Roman Reigns. Now he has a reason perhaps to interact with Reigns on a weekly basis. That's only going to help McIntyre, I think. So I think this gives him a lot of other, different possibilities now, fresh opponents. That's good, I think, for someone like Drew McIntyre. So I like the move for him. And I think this is one of the ones that we all kind of expected. With just the way they had built it up. I mean, he had lost some matches, going out, and everybody always compares it sort of the territories where guys lose matches going out of the territories and they wind up somewhere else, where not really anyone cares too much about what happened on the other territory and all this. So that's kind of the approach here, I think. And he's going to have that match with Big E at Crown Jewel for the WWE title. I mean, barring anything unforeseen, I think we understand that Big E's probably going to win that match, but I think this gives you a different dynamic here and gives you something, I think, for Drew McIntyre to kind of, sink his teeth into with some different possibilities. So I like the move for him. I think it's going to work out well. Jeff Hardy is another one. We talked about him in the Austin Theory thing. I think it'll be interesting to see, did they use that same sort of formula with Jeff Hardy? You would assume before they make the switch here, he's going to have that match with Austin Theory. If Theory wins, same situation where Hardy kind of, does the favor on his way out to the next town, which is SmackDown. But Jeff kind of teased the new character and all this other stuff. So maybe Jeff is someone you could throw into the mix against the Roman Reigns on a pay-per-view. They could certainly go that route. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So I think that's a possibility for Jeff Hardy. The Usos stay on SmackDown, even though they tried to play that up as a possible, switch and stuff. We all knew that was never going to happen. They just, it was a little suspense, but that suspense was removed pretty quickly on Raw. So the Usos stay. Jinder Mahal is now on SmackDown, I assume. Maybe they go back to, having more feuds between Drew and Jinder. I don't think so. But, again, it goes back to the split we talked about with Veer and Shanky. Shanky's on SmackDown. Jinder's there now. So I assume they'll keep those two, in a combination. It's in some form or fashion. But still, I guess, there's possibilities there. Who else? I mean, the New Day going back to SmackDown, should we be surprised? No. I mean, I didn't really think that they were going to keep the New Day together on Raw, and this was just a sign of that. Let's move Kofi and Xavier to SmackDown, and even that short-lived reunion, I just felt it was a WWE thing where they were going to move New Day back, and I think it's fine because we've seen, as much as I like the New Day reunions and love them together as a group. Like they are doing a very good job thus far, I think, with the Big E title run, and I think having him solo is not the worst idea in the world. Just to have him, kind of this sort of evolve his character and do different things because he has come across as a strong champion. I think if he beats Drew McIntyre, Crown Jewel, going to be an even stronger champion. So I think they have. I will give them credit on that. They've done a good job with Big E thus far. So I think making the switch, moving Kofi and Xavier back to SmackDown. I don't hate it. So we did mention, too, that Mace and T-Bar got split up. So there was another subtraction to the tag team division, although I don't think they really ever had a whole lot of expectations for those two. So I don't know if you necessarily call them perhaps some of the biggest winners or losers coming out of this because I don't really think Solo, I don't have high expectations for what WWE is going to do with them, but we will see. Of course, the most important thing is Baron Corbin, Happy Corbin, and Madcap Moss are going to be on SmackDown. They're staying there, so that's good for the Fox ratings, having those two there in those prime spots with these two. So what a duo! I gotta give them credit on that. Elsewhere, we talked about the Natalya Tamina split. Naomi, she stays on SmackDown, so that's something else. For people who are still kind of waiting and wondering, could she factor into the bloodline and all that? That is something that they could do, potentially. So she stays on SmackDown to keep that possibility there. Ricochet, I've been trying. We go back to some of the things we talked about. We go all the way back to Money in the Bank. I said, boy, coming out of this, Ricochet looked great in that match. I wonder if it's possible, if they're really going to go with this and do something with Ricochet. Well, they didn't, and now he goes to SmackDown. Will anything change? I don't have high hopes for it. So I'm not sure about Ricochet, even though, once we said, like, people who are making moves that haven't really done a whole lot, it's good. Like, that's a good thing for them, I think. So it's at least something that you could point to and say, well, that could be a positive. So we'll see if that's the case for Ricochet, but I think, remains, we just have not, there's no reason to be optimistic about this when it comes to Ricochet, though we'll see. We'll see if they do anything with him on that. Sami Zayn stays on SmackDown. Sasha, we talked about her. Shayna Baszler's an interesting one because we've seen them really push her here recently with some of these attacks on Eve Marie and Nia Jax. So I think that is one that I'm excited to see because I think for Shayna Baszler, they're at least establishing her once again as this kind of, loner character who can just go out and kick ass. And I think that's all she has to do because it works. And I hope they go with that here. And I think now she's got a pretty interesting mix of people to work with in terms of stars. Like she's got Charlotte there, she's got Sasha there. So I think that, they could go the route with Natalya and some of these others. Tony Storm, like we said, Xia Li. I mean, the Shayna Baszler, Xia Li, that's an interesting dynamic. So I like that there's at least possibilities for her on SmackDown. Sheamus, I talked about Sheamus. I think Sheamus is still one of the most underrated people in WWE. He just delivers. Like, I think that everything he does is usually a lot of fun. And I'm not saying that every match he has is 5 stars or anything, but I just think Sheamus is one of those guys that absolutely rock solid. You know what you're going to get out of him. And now that he moves to SmackDown, there's some more possibilities. Do they go the route of potentially pairing him once again with Cesaro? Do they bring the bar back? And do you have those guys maybe in a babyface form? Do they go after the Usos or something like that? I think there's also possibilities there. And, Sheamus is someone that I think you could, find some different things for him to do from singles feuds. Although, we've already seen it with Drew McIntyre. We've seen it with Jeff Hardy. I guess they could go to Sheamus and Cesaro. Sure, they could go back to that. But I think it's going to be interesting to see what they do with Sheamus because he is someone that, was kind of slotted in a top tier role. But I don't necessarily know, right off the bat, what did they do with him. So there is some intrigue with that. We mentioned the Shotzi and Tegan Nox thing, the split up. We'll see what it means for Shotzi. Is it going to be a good thing? Is it going to be a bad thing? Don't know. Tony Storm, are they going to do anything with her? I would hope so. Is it one where maybe they finally take, a more consistent approach to finding things to do with her and featuring her more? I mean, they're gonna have to in some of these spots, but I mean, now this is where you do have Charlotte, you do have Sasha. You can, put some of these and really, maybe have a better chance of establishing people like Tony Storm and Shotzi and some of these others we mentioned as call-ups. So that's a possibility as well. But that's kind of the overall thoughts. I think that, again, we didn't go through every single person that was drafted, but there's a lot of different, people there that you can kind of look at and say, all right, I can see the possibilities, but I can also understandably be in a position where not having a lot of optimism about what they're going to do here. And so I think that's understandable when you come out of the draft, but I don't love the draft concept. We've talked about it before. I mean, I think that it's how they do it sometimes is the biggest thing. And is it going to be able to work out for all parties? We know it's not going to work out for everyone, but it is an opportunity to create new stars, and it gives you perhaps fresh matchups, even though we've seen a lot of ones just due to the number of rematches and such we've seen in WWE, over the past year or two now. But it gives you an opportunity to have a fresh start for some of these people and really try to, build some new stars. And I think that's always the case here with the draft is, can you take some of these people who were perhaps doing nothing on another brand or in a very low spot? Can you make them a star on a different brand? Can you give them something that people can get behind? That's the question. And as we know, too, there are still a lot of people out there. There's Brock, Bailey, who's injured. We go down the list like Asuka, Elias. I'm pulling this up from our free agent list we have on 41mania.com, one of our stories. Eve Marie, Grand Metalik, Lindsay Dorado, Lacey Evans, Shane McMahon, Slapjack, Titus O'Neil, John Cena, Harry Smith. Those are all listed on WWE.com as the free agents coming out of this. So there are some people still, once Bailey returns, that will create an interesting dynamic for whichever brand she's on. Asuka, same situation, I think. And then, the Brock thing, I don't, Brock and John Cena, even though they list them as free agents, I think we kind of know what the nature is going to be. Brock's not going to be there every week. Because Cena's not, we don't know when Cena's going to be back at this point. So those are kind of understandable, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. I think there were some good things they did in this draft. I think, as always, there were some things that you kind of scratch your head about when it comes to splitting up some of these teams for seemingly no reason. And just how they do the draft itself, I've kind of just come to be like, all right, we know that when you're picking certain people behind, like the draft order to me does not make any difference anymore, because we know how they come about the process of doing the draft order. I have no idea. It's not a traditional draft where you're basically going from top to bottom. You're just kind of all over the place. Because otherwise, why are some of these people getting drafted ahead of the others? I get it, but that's what WWE has stuck to, and that's just the way they do it. So it's, it kind of is what it is from their standpoint when they do that. So there's some thoughts on the draft. I would love to hear your thoughts as well. You can let us know what you think over at 401mania.com. Check out everything we got going on over there, our news, reviews, columns, everything over there. Probably going to do some written stuff here on the draft as well on the site, so you'll be able to check that out at 401mania.com. As always, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Any podcast app you use, search for 401 on Wrestling, and continue to leave us a nice 5-star rating and review. That just helps the show reach more people. And subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Got a lot of stuff in the works headed up over there, so check that out on there. And as always, we'll have a link to the GoFundMe for Larry Zonka's family in the show notes, so be sure to continue to share and contribute to that if you can. And everything else, 411mania.com. But thanks as always for listening to the podcast, and we'll talk to you next time here on the 411 on Wrestling Podcast.